Good evening, everyone. I'm Allison Abra. I'm a faculty fellow in the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society and a history professor within the School of Humanities. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to the first event in this year's Richard McCarthy Lecture Series, which is, in some ways, our first event in the entire year as well. The focus of the McCarthy Lecture Series this year is going to be spies and espionage in 20th century war. We have Dr. Kathryn Barbier here to launch the series for us this evening, and then keep your eyes peeled for upcoming events. The other three talks in the series are going to take place at the end of January and then stretching into February. There will be three. We've just crystallized the schedule last week, so I can share it with you. Dr. Jeremy Black from the University of Exeter is going to come and talk about his new book on James Bond.
You'll need to tell me when that one is.
Dr. Larry Berman from Georgia State is going to come in to talk about a book that he wrote about a spy in the Vietnam War. And then I'm going to give the third talk based on my new book project about women who were agents for the British government during the Second World War. Now this is the 14th annual Richard McCarthy Lecture Series, which has been very generously supported and endowed by Dr. Richard McCarthy, who is over here, as well as Dr. Craig Howard. And we want, as always, to thank Dr. McCarthy and Dr. Howard for all of their support. So they have enabled us to bring a range of really amazing scholars to Hattiesburg over the years, as well as to share our own research in progress or upon its completion. And if you're interested in seeing any of the past McCarthy Lecture Series, they are all available on our YouTube channel, as are many other Dale Center events and presentations that have occurred over the years. And if you'd like to know more about the McCarthy Lecture Series or any of the things that the Dale Center is up to, there's a sign-in sheet over here on this table. If you could give us your contact information, we will keep you in the loop via email and other forms of social media. Also, if you are a student who is here in association with a class, there is a separate sign-up sheet for you. So make sure that you get to that as well. Since we are connected in all of the ways with the email as well, we are also tweeting. In fact, if you want to follow the Dale Center on Twitter, we are at Dale Center. And we have a hashtag for the McCarthy Lectures that you can also, if you want to tweet anything that you've heard tonight, please use the hashtag so that we can find you and follow us on Facebook as well. So those are all the ways to keep apprised with what we're up to, but just a few highlights of the upcoming schedule. The War and Society Roundtable at the Hattiesburg Public Library is currently ongoing with the theme 2FIC. There are flyers for that as well on the table. On October 2nd, so next week, there's an event at the Brownstone Center for the Arts at Pearl River Community College, in which our own Dr. Wiest, over there against the wall, is going to be participating in an event about the remembrance of the First World War, since we are in the centenary of the end of the war. That's October 2nd at 7 p.m. Watch social media for more information about that. And then the last thing that I want to mention is that just this week we have launched a very new and exciting initiative that might directly affect some of the people in this room. If you are a Southern Miss student, faculty member, or staff member, the Dale Center has now launched something called the Dale Center Research Awards, where you can apply for up to $1,000 of funding to take you to a conference or take you to somewhere where your archive is or where your creative activity is being presented. And there are also flyers about that there on the table. So we hope that you will look into those and take advantage of these funding opportunities, because we're really excited to be supporting all of the great work in War and Society happening around Southern Miss. Last announcement for me, please, you can tweet, but turn off your cell phones so they don't make a ton of noise while you do so. And I'm now going to turn the floor over to our founding director, Dr. Andy Wiest, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
It's a signal honor for me to do this. Mary Kathy Barbier, as far as I remember her, is professor of history at Mississippi State University, for which we'll forgive her. She is co-director of the Second World War Research Group and co-editor of the journal entitled War and History. She's the author of several monographs, including the one we're going to hear about tonight, Spies, Lies, and Citizenship, The Hunt for Nazi Criminals, And another one is entitled D-Day Deception, Operation Fortitude and the Normandy Invasion, one I know rather well. She's the also editor and co-editor of several other books. Drawing from a 2006 Justice Department report and other sources, Spies, Lies, and Citizenship exposes new information about infamous Nazi perpetrators. Here's a good word. Perpetrators, including somebody with a totally unpronounceable name, Andrija Karkukovic or something. Kurt Waldheim, a name I know, and Arthur Rudolph. That's an easy one because he's named after a reindeer. And the ongoing attempt to bring Nazis such as Joseph Mengele to justice. Tonight, Dr. Barbier will give us a talk from that book entitled Spies, Lies, and Citizenship. But the thing I want to add here at the end of this is that Dr. Barbier was my very first PhD student here at Southern Miss, and then thus the first to hold a PhD from what would become the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society. We certainly weren't named that then, but we're named that now. So I'd like to have you help me welcome back a true Southern Miss Golden Eagle and one of our most successful graduates, Dr. Kathryn Barbier.
Thank you. So are alums eligible for that research money?
No.
Darn. Well, you know, I'm at that rival school because, you know, can't work where you did your degree. At least back in the day you could, but that's okay. All right, so I'm so glad to see all of y'all. Welcome this evening, despite the rain. It's an honor to be here. I've done a couple of talks. We had a good session with grad students this afternoon, earlier today, so I was pleased to talk about publishing and other things. But let's get on to the topic at hand. In November 2010, the New York Times released a previously confidential report written by the Justice Department. It held secrets regarding the government's attempts to hunt down and prosecute accused Nazis who were living in the United States, and the government's post-war willingness to harbor and even employ some of these alleged criminals after World War II. The New York Times obtained and released, finally, this exhaustive 600-page report, The Office of Special Investigations, Striving for Accountability in the Aftermath of the Holocaust, which was written in 2006 by Judy Feigen and edited by Mark M. Richard, the former Assistant Attorney General of the Department of Justice Criminal Division, 4 years later as a result of a FOIA request. As the report indicated, the federal government was generally unsuccessful in pursuing legal action against alleged Nazi war criminals before 1979. Two events brought the changes that needed by the justice to pursue denaturalization and deportation cases successfully in court. Both changes resulted from initiatives by Elizabeth Holtzman, a New York congresswoman and member of the House Subcommittee on Immigration, Citizenship, and International Law. She found the increasing number of media stories about possible Nazi war criminals living in the U.S. troubling. Advocating the creation of an INS war crime strike force, Holtzman aired her views in the House and in the media. She did not hesitate to criticize publicly the State Department for its lack of cooperation with the INS investigations into war crimes allegations against naturalized Americans or resident foreigners. By 1979, because of persistent pressure from Holtzman, the Justice Department created the Office of Special Investigations, or OSI, and housed it in its criminal division. The creation of the OSI did not completely solve the problem. The legislation that the Justice Department used to initiate denaturalization and deportation proceedings against suspected war criminals was imperfect. Loopholes inhibited the carrying out of justice, or so it seemed. According to the OSI report, the Justice Department pursued some alleged war criminals for decades until the 1980s before achieving justice under a new law. In May 1978, Holtzman co-sponsored a bill, H.R. 12509, with Congressman Joshua Eilberg. This bill was, quote, an act to amend the Immigration and Naturalization Act to exclude into and to deport from the United States all aliens who persecuted any persons on the basis of race, religion, national origin, or political opinion under the direction of the Nazi government of Germany and for other purposes. Before passing it, however, the Senate strengthened the bill by adding two provisions. The first, Title I, is most pertinent for this discussion. It, quote, amends the Immigration and Naturalization Act to exclude from admission into and provide for the deportation from the United States of any alien who between March 23, 1933 and May 8, 1945, under the direction or in association with the Nazi government of Germany, or any government allied or collaborating with the Nazi government of Germany, engaged or assisted in, or incited or directed others to engage in the persecution of others on the basis of religion, race, national origin, or public opinion. President Jimmy Carter signed the bill into law when it arrived on his desk. This new law, closing the existing loopholes, made it more difficult for alleged war criminals to escape justice. So in my remaining time, I want to shine the spotlight on two of the OSI cases, those against Otto von Bolschwing and Arthur Rudolph, both of whom worked for the U.S. government after the war and both of whom the OSI investigated. Now, many of you may have seen the trailer for the new movie Operation Finale, which came briefly to Starkville and left very briefly, so I haven't had the chance to see it. But it's about the efforts of a team of top secret Israeli agents who traveled to Argentina to track down Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi mastermind of the transportation of millions of Jews to concentration camps where many died. Otto von Bolschwing and, let's see, can I? Yeah, there you go. There he is. He's a nice looking gentleman. Otto von Bolschwing and Adolf Eichmann worked together to create programs that were designed both to persecute and terrorize the Jewish population, first in Germany and then in countries occupied by German forces. As a chief SS officer, von Bolschwing received postings to Romania and Greece, where he was personally involved with establishing policy that targeted the Jewish population. His role in creating these policies, however, predates the war. While working for the Jewish Affairs Office from 1937 to 1939, von Bolschwing presented a report entitled The Jewish Problem. In it, he advocated eliminating Jews from Germany, quote, by forcing them to emigrate, and on more than one occasion offered suggestions for accomplishing his proposed plan. In 1940, von Bolschwing received a posting to Romania, where he was instrumental in facilitating the escape of Romanian Guard leaders to Germany. Now, the Iron Guard were an ultra-fascist movement that unsuccessfully tried to overthrow the pro-German government in Romania. Before the war ended, however, von Bolschwing transferred to Austria, and in an effort to protect himself, actually cooperated with the Allies by helping them capture a number of high-ranking Nazi officials and SS officers. By 1949, he found employment with the CIA, which turned a blind eye to his past, his SS membership, and his work for the SD. In 1954, the CIA helped von Bolschwing move to the U.S., and in 1979, however, the newly created OSI began an investigation of the German. In doing so, they wanted answers to numerous questions, including how could the CIA help this Nazi? What did he bring to the table? Did he provide crucial information for the post-war World War II Cold War battlefront? Was his work for the CIA more important than holding him accountable for his past actions? So I think the key to answering these questions is to examine briefly von Bolschwing's usefulness, first to the Nazis and then to the CIA, before focusing on the OSI investigation of him. Otto Albrecht Alfred von Bolschwing, who joined the Nazi Party in 1929 and quickly embraced its racist ideology, forged a relationship with the German Foreign Office, who sent him in 1932 to Palestine, where he was also an SD liaison. Because of his activities that included encouraging the Jews to rebel against British authority and Arab leaders to support Jewish attempts to remove the British presence in the region, the British booted him out of Palestine in 1936. With his return to Berlin, von Bolschwing worked with Leopold von Mildenstein, the director and founder of the Jewish Affairs Department, to draft policies for the elimination of Jewish influence from German life. Although von Mildenstein offered him a job with the Jewish Affairs Department, von Bolschwing declined because he did not want to be bound by any of its rules. Instead, he became a consultant to the Jewish Affairs Office from 1939 to 1937 until 1939. Within a few weeks of his association, von Bolschwing drafted a report about Palestine, which gained the attention of influential government officials such as SS Chief Heinrich Himmler. It did not take von Bolschwing long to figure out, however, that although his report was interesting and informative, it did not marry up completely with the stated mission of the Jewish Affairs Department. Quickly shifting his focus, von Bolschwing addressed the Jewish problem in his next report, submitted in January 1937. In this, he attempted to shape policy by suggesting ways in which to eliminate the Jewish presence in Germany, primarily by forced emigration and limitation of Jews' economic power. This took the existing German policy dedicated to the elimination of the Jewish presence in Germany through exodus, not extermination, a step further. Von Bolschwing, who advocated extreme methods if necessary, recommended terror as a way to convince Jews to participate in the mass exodus. Recognizing that using targeted terror against Jews might not accomplish the ultimate goal of the mass exodus of Jews from Germany, he recommended steps that would be the precursor to the Nazi government's appropriating Jewish-owned businesses. This dovetailed with his next recommendation for solving the Jewish problem. Von Bolschwing argued, quote, "The Jews in the entire world represent a nation which is not bound by a country or by a people, but by money. The leading thought is to purge Germany of the Jews. This can only be carried out when the basis of livelihood, i.e. the possibility of economic activity, is taken away from the Jews in Germany." If the Nazis implemented his recommendations, Jews would no longer reside in Germany, and the Nazi government would confiscate the bulk of their financial resources at the time of their departure. Buying this hook, line, and sinker, the Germans put this policy in place in Austria following the 1938 Anschluss. Now, despite his hopes, von Bolschwing's upward career path was not a smooth one. His posting to Romania did not please his superiors, who viewed his support for the Iron Guard's coup attempt as problematic and resulted in his incarceration in a Gestapo prison for almost a year. Afterwards, von Bolschwing would not receive another plum for an assignment. Instead, he returned to work in which he helped the Reich appropriate Jewish assets. In other words, he was in the Jewish extortion business. Ever the opportunist, he lined his own pockets while orchestrating the transfer of Jewish companies to his Nazi bosses. By 1944, however, von Bolschwing, recognizing that the war was not going favorably for Germany, indeed a German victory was becoming increasingly unlikely, he began to make a plan to guarantee his survival, a plan that would prevent him from being a recipient of the retribution that the victors were sure to hand out. His brother-in-law was a member of a resistance movement in Austria called O5. This gave von Bolschwing the seed of an idea, one that grew and bore fruit. Moving his family to Salzburg, Austria, he joined O5, and his work with a unit situated in the Tyrolean Alps began. Like a chameleon, von Bolschwing reinvented himself and was convincing in his new skin. In fact, the leader of his local resistance unit bought his act and after the war signed an affidavit attesting to Bolschwing's career in the Austrian resistance. He was positioning himself to be on the right side at war's end. Unbeknownst to von Bolschwing, he was actually on the Allied intelligence radar. British intelligence had amassed a list of known German intelligence officers and given that list, which included von Bolschwing's name, to two U.S. intelligence organizations, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, and the Army's Counterintelligence Corps, CIC. When von Bolschwing initially crossed paths with Americans, however, they were not members of the OSS or the CIC, but rather a military government unit eventually tasked with occupation. As the end of the war neared, von Bolschwing established a connection with Lieutenant Colonel Ray F. Goggin of the American 410th Infantry and offered his services. He successfully drew attention to his resistance work in Austria and helped his new American friends intercept his former compatriots. Goggins later sang von Bolschwing's praises when he claimed, quote, "During our occupation, he personally captured over 20 high-ranking Nazi officials and SS officers and led patrols that resulted in the capture of many more." Von Bolschwing wanted to be on the winning side at the end and took steps to ensure that he was. Furthermore, if the Americans considered him a valuable asset, they might help him avoid prosecution for his role in the persecution of Jews, if it came to light. Although von Bolschwing's work with the U.S. military personnel continued into 1946, his position was not a permanent one. So, believing that he could prolong his beneficial relationship by taking advantage of his experience in intelligence work, von Bolschwing took steps to seal the deal. He reached out to the Gehlen organization, which was receptive and hired him. Funded and supervised by the U.S. Army, the Gehlen organization, created by Richard Gehlen and including numerous former Nazi intelligence officials, facilitated the collection of intelligence about the Soviet Union. As a new member of the organization, von Bolschwing received a relatively easy but important assignment. Gehlen tasked him with identifying ethnic German and former Romanian Iron Guard contacts who could be potentially useful sources of information. Although the backgrounds of von Bolschwing, Gehlen, and other members of the organization were dubious, their American bosses were willing to look the other way because the possibility of acquiring information useful in the Cold War battle against the Soviet Union was more important than turning any of these men over for war crimes prosecution. Viewing the Gehlen organization as a temporary connection, von Bolschwing sought employment with the CIG, the Central Intelligence Group, particularly since his job with the Gehlen organization was in jeopardy. He had not provided many useful intelligence contacts. And uncertain that he could be trusted, the CIG's initial assessment of von Bolschwing was not a favorable one. Not one to give up, he continued his efforts at recruitment by the CIG and then by the CIA. Over the next couple of years, the CIA assessments of von Bolschwing remained consistent with the CIG's initial evaluation. According to the CIA, quote, most evaluations run as follows: self-seeking, egotistical, and a man of shifting loyalties. His protests of democracy, and more particularly feelings of Austrian nationalism, seemed to contradict his history. Now, what the CIA was unaware of, though, was his association with the Jewish Affairs Office or Adolf Eichmann, factors that could potentially turn the tide against him. Now, although von Bolschwing referred to himself as a Nazi gadfly, that did not fool the CIA. According to another assessment, quote, he's an adventurer, a lover of intrigue, and a wire puller who is fond of power. Now, while the CIA pondered recruiting or rejecting him, von Bolschwing demonstrated his usefulness to the Gehlen organization, which by 1947 was enlarging its operations into the Balkan region, and sought his help. Although he was confident of his capabilities, von Bolschwing did not live up to Gehlen's expectations. After working with him for over a year, Gehlen decided, quote, that the smooth-talking Bolschwing was an operational blowhard not worth the black market gas, cigarettes, and US dollars required to pay him, and seriously considered cutting ties with him. Oddly enough, despite his poor track record, the CIA had second thoughts about rejecting von Bolschwing's overtures. In late 1949 into early 1950, the CIA decided to hire several members of the Gehlen organization, including von Bolschwing. CIA bought into von Bolschwing's assessment of his intelligence career that had spanned, according to him, from 1934 until 1949, even though it was a less than stellar one. Although recognizing that he was not a skilled agent, the CIA viewed him as controllable, a valuable asset who had connections that could possibly be useful. The problem was, or rather had the potential to be, the fact that von Bolschwing had not disclosed everything about his career. Although they knew he had helped the Iron Guard leaders escape from Romania, CIA field representatives did not seem inclined to investigate the veracity of von Bolschwing's version of his past. Overworked and short-staffed, they were more focused on what they needed from the German in Austria than anything else. Unfortunately for the CIA, things were about to get more complicated. It soon became apparent that von Bolschwing, who claimed to be an expert in Austrian politics, had been padding his resume. Because he hadn't falsified anything else, right? So in early 1950, when the Austrian Interior Ministry requested copies of von Bolschwing's Nazi Party records from U.S. Army Berlin Documentation Center, these files conveniently disappeared. The CIA did not want von Bolschwing's past publicized. The fact remained, however, that the CIA's actions to whitewash his past gave von Bolschwing a certain advantage. There was concern that CIA support of von Bolschwing opened the door to him becoming, quote, a major political problem if not managed carefully. While the CIA reassessed its relationship with the German, however, von Bolschwing acquired CIA Austria's help in achieving his long-term goal, retirement to the U.S., followed by U.S. citizenship, which turned out to be the more ambitious of the two. While U.S. government officials reluctantly agreed that citizenship was a possibility, they recommended that the CIA sever all ties to von Bolschwing. In August 1953, CIA headquarters approved his move to the U.S., noted that his Nazi Party membership might delay things, and announced its intention to part ways with the troublesome German once he had emigrated. With the CIA's information about his background, the INS granted von Bolschwing an immigration visa. There was, however, still a problem. The CIA raised legitimate concerns about von Bolschwing's ability to obtain U.S. citizenship lawfully. Although the CIA had second thoughts about recommending that von Bolschwing deny his problematic memberships and sought advice about its recommendation, the record indicates that the responding "tell the truth" advice did not make a difference. In a letter to the INS commissioner, the CIA confirmed that it had employed von Bolschwing and that he was not a security risk, failed to note his Nazi background, and requested that INS expedite his file and entry into the U.S. By January 1954, von Bolschwing and his family had emigrated to the United States. Although the CIA did not give him a job, he ultimately landed a position with Warner Lambert Pharmaceutical Company, where he assisted the vice president for foreign exports. In 1959, he submitted his citizenship application. Keeping the CIA recommendations in mind, he neglected to provide truthful information about his Alamein SS, Nazi Party, SD, or RSHA memberships. However, he subsequently contacted the INS, admitted that he had omitted some information in his application, and offered to supply it verbally. Later that year, despite his admission, INS granted von Bolschwing U.S. citizenship. Unfortunately for him, various bits about his past began to surface that would eventually lead to the government investigation. In 1960, the capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina led von Bolschwing to contact his former CIA handler and express concern that Israeli agents would kidnap him. Uncertain about the source of this fear, the handler sought information from CIA's counterintelligence staff and was shocked to learn that von Bolschwing's Nazi past and connections to Eichmann and the Jewish Affairs Office. He claimed, quote, "We would not have used him at that time had we known about it." The question of who knew what and when about von Bolschwing is up for debate. But at this point, things were about to heat up. In 1961, he took steps to attain a political position. He received nomination for a State Department overseas assignment to India. It looked like he was about to embark on the political career they had always desired. One could almost hear him rubbing his hands together with glee. He was on his way. Around that same time, however, the CIA, in an attempt to establish closer relationships with Israeli intelligence organizations, searched their files for the names of German officers with connections to Eichmann for use in his trial for war crimes. On the list of known Eichmann associates was one Otto Albrecht Alfred von Bolschwing. The evidence was even more damning. According to captured documents, the former CIA agent had helped Eichmann persecute Austrian Jews. Von Bolschwing's past, if publicized, could become a major headache for the CIA. It could not get any worse. Or could it? It could. Further CIA investigation into the architect of the final solution uncovered troubling information. CIA officials questioned those who had worked closely with von Bolschwing at Austrian station. One of those interrogated in 1961 claimed that after von Bolschwing had left Austria, it became clear that at least one of the German agents was fraudulent. The question then became what the CIA should do with this information and what action they should potentially take against von Bolschwing. CIA officials met with him. During the meeting, they informed their former employee that falsification of his records was grounds for legal action against him. In fact, because von Bolschwing was not honest, had actually lied about his role in the persecution of Jews, the CIA should contact either the U.S. Justice Department or the West German government. If the agency did this, things did not bode well for von Bolschwing. But the CIA struck a deal with him instead. The agency did not turn him over to the Department of Justice or to the West German government. and in exchange, von Bolschwing withdrew his application to the U.S. government-sponsored position in India. At this point, the agency, which hoped to avoid political embarrassment, did not want to acknowledge, publicly or privately, the role it played in bringing von Bolschwing to the U.S. Furthermore, if von Bolschwing faded away into the sunset, the agency would be relieved, but it feared that would not happen. Consequently, CIA officials made it clear to von Bolschwing that if asked, they would not lie on his behalf. Things had been dicey for a while, but once the agreement with the CIA was in place, von Bolschwing breathed a sigh of relief. He was safe from prosecution for war crimes by the US, West German, or Austrian governments. He settled down to a quiet life for a time. By 1969, von Bolschwing and his family had relocated to California, where he found employment with Trans International Computer Investment Corporation, a computer leasing company that had lucrative contracts with the Department of Defense. He worked his way up in the company to vice president, but in 1971, the company filed for bankruptcy. By this time, von Bolschwing was 62 years old and not exactly employable. While he was eligible to retire with a reduced Social Security benefit at 62, he could not receive full benefits until he was 65. For the next decade, he lived under the radar. But in 1978, the year that his wife Ruth committed suicide, von Bolschwing came to the attention of the Special Litigation Unit of the INS because of its investigation into someone else, U.S. Bishop Valerian Trivia, and his wartime record, which included an association with the Iron Guard. This time, scrutiny would just not fade away. In 1979, von Bolschwing found himself in the middle of competing investigations by the SLU, which not only called him to testify against Trivia, but also opened a full-scale inquiry into him, despite confirmation from the CIA that the SLU's investigation would compromise the agency. Although the CIA dragged its feet in providing the requested information about its former agent, Alan Ryan, the director of the newly created OSI, put pressure on the agency to respond, which it did finally in the summer of 1980. The CIA also agreed to testify about facts that von Bolschwing did or did not supply. In addition to claiming that the CIA had told von Bolschwing to answer naturalization questions truthfully, the agent denied helping the German obtain naturalization or employing him after his move to the U.S. It failed to acknowledge that ties were not immediately severed. Now, it was very clear to the OSI investigators that von Bolschwing had not been honest on both his visa and citizenship applications. Therefore, he had entered the country illegally. In addition, he had fraudulently received naturalization. Now, although the case seemed to be straightforward, it was far from that. Several factors made the situation less than ideal as far as the OSI was concerned. First, there was a missing secret file. Without the file, the CIA could not definitively confirm or deny that von Bolschwing had provided the information either in a written statement or in an interview. The second problem related to von Bolschwing's citizenship application. In 1959, the INS had received a letter from him in which he referred to, quote, additional information which might be in a file, end quote, and offered to expand on that information verbally. In an effort for clarity, OSI investigators questioned the INS agent who had received von Bolschwing's forms and had interrogated him. After consulting his case file notes, the agent confirmed that von Bolschwing had failed to supply information about his various troublesome affiliations. The OSI was also concerned that von Bolschwing might assert that the CIA had told him to omit information. These concerns were justified because von Bolschwing did just that. This was particularly problematic for the OSI because von Bolschwing's CIA contact, who may or may not have told him to be truthful, was deceased by this time. The OSI continued to seek additional information from the CIA, the INS, and the State Department, but with limited success. They also interrogated von Bolschwing. In early 1981, the OSI had a formal sit-down, official and on the record, meeting with von Bolschwing at his California home. Goldman, Gus von Bolschwing, represented his father during the interview and did most of the talking, defended his father vociferously. Arguing that American authorities had all the facts about his father before he moved to the U.S., the Sun asserted that the OSI investigation was hypocritical at best. He claimed that proving the case was virtually impossible so many years later. According to the Sun, further complicating the situation was von Bolschwing's declining health, which made it difficult for him to remember the past accurately. In spite of these issues, Director Ryan was confident that the OSI had a winnable case against von Bolschwing and wanted to move forward. But Deputy Assistant Attorney General Mark Richard disagreed and recommended that Ryan file charges based only on the naturalization case. So in May 1981, the OSI made its move against von Bolschwing by filing a 3-count complaint in U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of California. According to the complaint, von Bolschwing attained naturalization through misrepresentation of his past. His failure to acknowledge membership in questionable organizations indicated his, quote, lack of good moral character, which was a prerequisite for citizenship. Furthermore, his willingness to swear under oath to false information was, quote, further evidence of lack of good moral character. Adding a new twist to the story, von Bolschwing responded to the charges in the press. He denied membership in the SS, the SD, or the Gestapo, and claimed that he'd actually worked for the OSS during the war and had parachuted into Austria. Ryan, who issued his own statement refuting von Bolschwing's claim, stated that the evidence proved that von Bolschwing was never a double agent for the U.S. Now that said, the case was not a slam dunk for the OSI, but not because the organization did not have the evidence to make its case in court. The problem was von Bolschwing. Even though he made statements to the press, he had serious health issues that raised questions about his ability to understand the court proceedings or participate in his own defense. And by this time, he was living in a nursing home. The doctors diagnosed him with a progressive neurological disorder which impaired his memory and intellectual functioning. Recognizing that taking the accused to trial under the circumstances and that deportation would spark a media nightmare, Ryan negotiated a deal with von Bolschwing and his attorneys. He would surrender his citizenship certificate but be allowed to remain in the U.S. The district court signed off on the plea agreement that required von Bolschwing publicly admit that he had failed to disclose his memberships in criminal organizations on his citizenship application. Von Bolschwing stated that he would not contest the loss of his citizenship, and the United States announced that it did not intend to deport him unless his health improved. The judge made the agreement official on the 22nd of December 1981. 10 weeks later, at the age of 72, Otto Albrecht Alfred von Bolschwing died. Now, at the end of the day, the OSI achieved a form of justice. Although he had lost his citizenship, von Bolschwing did not have to suffer the added humiliation of deportation. But he did not get to enjoy his reprieve for very long. Now, as the Bolschwing example indicates, working for the government in the post-war era did not guarantee the desired outcomes, at least not in the long term. And another example that illustrates this is the Arthur Rudolph case. Oh, sorry. There you go. You can tell where he wound up based on this picture, right? In August 1984, after receiving the Distinguished Service Award from NASA and 30 years as a naturalized American, 78-year-old Arthur Rudolph forfeited his U.S. citizenship and left the United States under a cloud of suspicion, never to return. According to the OSI, his actions while working as a rocket scientist for the Nazis reportedly involved persecution and mistreatment of Jews and other prisoners. So what crimes did this mild-mannered man, who had the distinction of being the only paperclip scientist prosecuted by the OSI, commit? After all, the Department of Justice did not prosecute him in a court of law, nor did a judge strip him of his citizenship. He voluntarily relinquished it and agreed to leave the country. So was he the innocent that he later claimed to be? In 1929, pressured by his friends, Rudolph joined the Nazi Party. 3 years later, he teamed up with Alphonse Peitz to design and successfully launch a rocket. When that fell through because Peitz ran off with their money, Rudolph got a job developing artillery rockets for the Army Ordnance Department with Werner von Braun, a name that you all should all recognize, and Walter Riedel. The three men, working for Captain and later General Walter Dornberger, built and experimented with increasingly larger liquid fuel rockets. In December 1934, Rudolph and a group from Kummersdorf tested 2 A-2 rockets on the island of Borkum in the North Sea. The rockets, which performed well, reached a height of 1.5 miles. The scientists also conducted tests on a rocket engine that Rudolph designed. During this period, Rudolph established a close working relationship and friendship with von Braun. The two men shared an interest in space travel and a belief that it was possible to build a rocket capable of flying to the moon and beyond. And discussions of their ideas and designs kept them up all hours of the night. The future of the two men would be inextricably linked. In May 1937, a new rocket center at Peenemünde became operational, and Rudolph and other Kummersdorf staff moved there. This was an exciting time for Rudolph. Testing on liquid fuel rockets continued for the next several years, but it was not until the 13th of June 1942 that the first attempt to launch a V-2 rocket occurred. On the 3rd of October of that year, Rudolph and his colleagues successfully tested a V-2 rocket. Government support for the program increased after July of 1943. When he learned about the V-2 rocket program, Himmler recognized the need for maintaining secrecy about the rocket program and its expansion, and supposedly suggested that the best way to ensure security would be to utilize a workforce that consisted entirely of concentration camp internees. The plan received Hitler's approval. From this point on, the rocket center at Peenemünde did not lack funds, equipment, or manpower, and Dornberger tasked Rudolph with designing the pilot production plant for the site. By August, Rudolph had the assembly line ready for the production of V-2 rockets, but British bombing raids against Peenemünde resulted in relocation of the production facility to Middelburg. Rudolph received orders to oversee operations at the new production facility. But Middelburg was not what Rudolph expected. It consisted of a series of factories located in tunnels constructed in the mountains, and the workforce consisted of forced laborers from Buchenwald, whom the SS would house in a new concentration camp, Dora Nordhausen. The prisoners performed 2 functions: additional excavation of the tunnels in the underground complex and work on the V-2 assembly line next to German civilians, which was a violation of Geneva Convention. In mid-March 1945, when all production at Middelburg ceased, Rudolph received orders to relocate to Oberammergau in Bavaria. Traveling south, he was one of a group captured by the Americans in late April. Rudolph found himself reunited with von Braun and Dornberger in Garmisch, where they and others underwent interrogation by the Americans, who were identifying scientists who could potentially be useful in furthering the development of missiles for the war effort. Likewise, the British, who wanted to successfully construct and fire a V-2 rocket, set up Operation Backfire to do so when the war in Europe ended. Temporarily transferred to the British by the Americans, Rudolph worked on Backfire from July to October 1945. Transferred back to the Americans, he traveled to the U.S. under the auspices of Operation Paperclip, which targeted engineers who had experience with the development of guided missiles and aerodynamics. Although lacking critical information about his background, INS vetted and approved Rudolph's relocation to the U.S. What the INS did know was that Rudolph had been a member of the Nazi Party and had worked at Middelburg. What INS did not know was that Rudolph had utilized slave labor at Middelburg. After undergoing interrogation in Boston, Rudolph and other members of the team continued their work on the V-2 rocket project in several locations, including Fort Bliss. In 1949, he passed an FBI background check because he was not an ardent Nazi, a war criminal, or a threat, and received a visa. His emigration to the U.S. became official. A year later, he transferred to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, where he worked for the next decade. Applying for citizenship in 1951, Rudolph became a naturalized citizen 3 years later. In 1961, he joined NASA, where he teamed up with his old friend, Wernher von Braun. Before retiring in 1969, Rudolph was the Saturn V rocket program project director for 5 years. Putting a man on the moon in July 1969 was the culmination of Rudolph's dream. Receiving NASA's exceptional service and distinguished service medals was just icing on the cake. After overcoming some health issues, Rudolph enjoyed retirement until an OSI investigation of his wartime work at Middlework shattered his world. In 1979, Eli Rosenbaum, an OSI intern, learned about Rudolph when he read two books. Dora, the Nazi concentration camp where modern space technology was born and 30,000 prisoners died, by Jean Michel, and Frederick Ordway's The Rocket Team from the V2 to the Saturn Moon Rocket. The inside story of how a small group of engineers changed world history. There are two things related to the same event that raised red flags for Rosenbaum. First, he read an account of a complaint by Rudolph, who lamented the fact that he had to leave a New Year's Eve party because he had to supervise the movement of some rocket parts. The picture that accompanied the vignette revealed who was relegated to moving those rocket parts. Rudolph had to lead the party to supervise prisoners of war, who in violation of the Geneva Convention were handling rocket parts, which constituted munitions. Rosenbaum was so appalled by what he read in Ordway's book that when he went to work for OSI a year later, he made every effort to persuade his boss to approve an investigation of Rudolph. More troubling for Rosenbaum was what was revealed by the initial investigation: Rudolph's involvement in an execution of Dora internees, which followed accusations of sabotage at the V2 construction site. Of 12 inmates accused of sabotage, 6 were sentenced to hanging. Not only did Rudolph attend the hanging, but he also ordered laborers whom he supervised to witness the event. This incident revealed that Rudolph had a more intimate knowledge of the prisoners than he had acknowledged in a 1947 interview for a U.S. military court investigating the executions. The OSI now had the ammunition that it needed to confront him, and they conducted 2 interviews of Rudolph, one in October 1982, the other in February of 1983. During these interviews, Rudolph admitted a number of things that the OSI ultimately found problematic. He acknowledged that while he was at Middlework, he had been aware that disease, overwork, mistreatment, and malnutrition had resulted in prisoners' deaths. Because these deaths caused a reduction in the available workforce for V2 rocket production, Rudolph, quote, had requested labor replacements from the SS and knew that these replacements came probably from Buchenwald or somewhere else. Furthermore, Rudolph acknowledged that he had the authority to assign laborers to specific tasks within the Middlework facility. These admissions suggested that Rudolph had perhaps not been completely forthcoming when INS vetted him for paperclip and when he applied for citizenship. The OSI had to determine the next appropriate step. Based on the gathered evidence and the 1947, 1982, and 1983 interviews, the OSI concluded that a mistake had been made in allowing Rudolph to both to enter the U.S. formally and to obtain citizenship. Consequently, they advised filing denaturalization action and justified its recommendation. Rudolph, as supervisor, quote, was directly responsible for exploiting slave laborers. Therefore, he violated the State Department's regulation barring entry to persons who participated, advocated, or acquiesced in activities to conduct contrary to civilization and human decency. Furthermore, forcing inmates to witness the hangings of other laborers constituted a form of terror that contributed to their persecution. As such, Rudolph's persecutory activities in themselves were heinous and indicated that he lacked, quote, the good moral character required for citizenship. Consequently, as far as the OSI was concerned, Rudolph should forfeit his right to be a citizen of the U.S. Receiving approval from justice, OSI notified Rudolph. Informed that prosecution was imminent, Rudolph took an unexpected step. He instructed his attorney to negotiate a written agreement with the federal government. Under the terms of the agreement, the government would agree not to prosecute Rudolph in exchange for 2 concessions from the German, who would not only leave the U.S., but he would also renounce his U.S. citizenship. In exchange for the government's willingness to wait until he left before making any announcement about the situation, Rudolph consented not to dispute the government's contention that he had persecuted unarmed civilians during his time at Middlework. On the 28th of November 1983, 3 men, OSI Director Neil Schur, Arthur Rudolph and Rudolph's attorney, George H. Main, signed the agreement. In a signed statement, Rudolph admitted his culpability and noted, quote, "I agree permanently to depart the United States by March 29, 1984, at my own expense." He then stated that he would obtain the documents necessary for his departure and that on or before June 1st, 1984, he would renounce his citizenship at a U.S. embassy or consulate, at which time he would turn over his passport or have it stamped canceled. In October 1984, in Germany, Rudolph relinquished his passport. And although he subsequently tried to return to the U.S. and failed in 2 lawsuits against the Department of Justice, the book on Rudolph finally closed with his death in 1996. The flawed protocol for vetting former members of the Axis and refugees who applied for relocation allowed possible war criminals to evade justice and obtain new life in the U.S. Although some former Nazis figured out how to game the system, in all likelihood it did not take much effort to do so because the sheer number of those seeking asylum overwhelmed those doing the vetting. The fact remains that government officials allowed many with dubious pasts into the country because they had a commodity on offer that would be useful in the emerging Cold War. At the end of the day, however, historians evaluating the past can pose the following question for analysis, and I ask it as a way to initiate a possible discussion. Did the potential for providing a service for the Cold War battlefield outweigh the miscarriage of justice that occurred when alleged war criminals gained entry into the U.S. and when war crimes went unpunished, at least for a time? Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions. Anyone?
Ooh, sorry, I ran over.
No, you're fine.
Okay.
We have 10 minutes. So.
Okay.
Yeah, questions? Yeah.
Did Rudolph die a natural death?
I'm sorry?
Did he die a natural death or did he go on trial?
No, he died a natural death. But he tried, he applied for a visa. He went to Hamburg and applied for a visa to come back into the U.S. and that was denied. He tried to get in through Canada and the U.S. government notified the Canadians and they deported him back to Germany. And then he filed these 2 lawsuits that went nowhere. He claimed that he was coerced into giving up his citizenship and leaving the U.S. But I think his daughter remained in the U.S., which might have been why he was trying to get back in. Yeah.
Does Bolschwing's family still live in the U.S.? I know you mentioned his son was talking about the
Honestly, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised. When Andrei Artukovic, the name that you can't pronounce that I couldn't pronounce it, can't pronounce it very well, his family still lives in the U.S. because his son got in touch with me and sent me his version of events and acknowledged that my narrative coincided with the existing record. And he was somebody who spent his whole life defending his father. He was born in the U.S. after the family had come over in the wake of the war, and so he had his father's version. And there were multiple emails from him, and I just thanked him and said I knew how difficult this was, and they've kind of petered out. But right after the book came out, he got in touch. And well, you know, the typical, his dad got a bad rap. He was never Nazi. He never did anything wrong. Yeah, you know, that whole thing. Yeah. Yes.
What was the scope of the deportations by the OSI, and did Germany always accept them back?
Oh no. In fact, when Rudolph wound up in Germany, the German government wasn't totally happy because they hadn't agreed to accept them. In some of the cases, there is a big gap between ordered deportation and the actual deportation because they've got to find somebody to take them. And in some cases, the original recipient was supposed to be Germany, and then it's like, well, we're going to amend that and add these other countries. The guy who was just deported recently, it took them 14 years to find a country to take him. So, you know, what's on your resume? Oh, well, we accepted, you know, this war criminal into our country after they were deported by the United States. So, and the OSI doesn't investigate a huge number of cases, and so I talk primarily about some of their successes in the book, but and I try to look at a variety. So I look at Rudolph, and then I have a chapter on possible war criminals who aren't investigated, von Braun. And that could be because he died the year before the OSI was created, except that the OSI was involved with identifying the remains in Argentina that proved to be Mengeles, right? So it's not like they weren't involved in investigating people who were dead. And then there are also at Redstone and then NASA with von Braun and Rudolph were Bernard Tessman and Karl Heimberg, both of whom were interviewed by Chuck Bolton, and the interview is in the archives in McCain here. They were never investigated, but they weren't top officials, and they don't get the same sort of notoriety over the Saturn V project that von Braun does, and certainly Rudolph does. And I don't get the sense that they were, I think they were minor players of the team at Middlework and Peenemünde. So they weren't really on anybody's radar. I don't know that they were supervising anybody. But the other thing I think with von Braun is he's the face of Mr. Space, right? How do you investigate Mr. Space, right? Because he's the person that's held up to everybody. And how do you then say, oh, well, hey, NASA's doing some great things, but look at how they got them done. Right, so it's whether or not you want to open that can of worms, and certainly the report doesn't talk about whether or not they considered investigating him or not. There was Carl Linus, who was a camp guard supervisor in Estonia, who lies on his paperwork, said he was a student that whole time. And his father says he was a student. His father filed the displaced persons documentation listing his son as a member of the family. And it's years later, when he's in the U.S. and he's up in New York, has a job, and the Soviet Union identified 6 people from that concentration camp that they were looking for, and his name was on it, and he's riding to work with his coworker, and he said, "Is that you?" And he said, "Well, I was just a minor guard, but yeah, it was me." And then that kind of starts the ball rolling to the investigation. And then, who was it? Artukovic kind of outed himself, but we can come back to that. Yeah?
What's your opinion on the CIA allowing these 2 men or others to obtain the U.S. citizenship?
Oh, yeah, so we're going to go back to that moral question that I don't really quite know the answer to.
Did you put your opinion in the book any? Or?
Well, no, because that's not my job as an historian, yeah. Right? I think we have to understand the rationale behind, right? And so it's early Cold War. They're trying to get every bit of information they can on the Soviets. U.S. intelligence is not the only one that employs some of these former Nazi intelligence officers. The Soviets do it, the British do it, the East Germans do it. Right or wrong, they're all doing it because they're all trying to get information on the other. When paperclip is implemented at the end of the war, the idea is that the war in Europe's over, but the war in the Pacific is not. So these guys, a lot of these guys who come over are originally tasked with working on Army ordnance. It's only later that some of them wind up at Redstone and then working for NASA. It was seen more important at the time to have advantage of that expertise because they need to win the war against Japan. That war ends relatively quickly, but things are heating up with the Soviets, and so let's still use this. So to some extent it's exploitation, but these people get something out of it too. They get to come to the US, some long-term, some get citizenship. Not all of them get investigated. The OSI only investigates cases that they're aware of, right? So one of the things I discovered, so I'm going to, a little story about this book. In my chapter on Operation Paperclip, for that chapter I'd gone to the National Archives and I was looking at some of the files, and there are lists of scientists and engineers and technicians. They're interested in people who are working on biological weapons, on chemical technology, more than just ordnance. The British want some of these same people. They are not necessarily interested in bringing them to the UK for long term, but they want them in 6-month blocks to provide certain information. And these people, a lot of them don't want to be caught by the Soviets. In fact, von Braun takes 200 engineers and technicians who worked on the V2 project down to Bavaria just so they can surrender to the Americans rather than be captured by the Soviets. But you have these lists. Here are the people that the Americans want, here are the people that the British want, and here's the list of the people that they both want. And there are various iterations of this. And because I grew up in the South watching football, when I read through that, I thought, oh gosh, this is so like the NFL draft. And so I wrote about it in that way, and I got pushback from the woman who did my red line edits. She's like, oh, you're trivializing. I said, well, I'm not talking about war criminals, and I'm talking about this relationship that emerges that's mutually beneficial. It might have started out as exploitation, but they're willing participants in that exploitation because they're getting something in exchange. She wanted me to take the word draftee out of the chapter, everywhere it was. And I said, guess what? Soldiers were drafted. We're talking about drafting the cream of the crop here. So whether you use a sports analogy or something else, it's still drafting in some fashion. I stuck to my guns and left it in. I read it to my mom. And I said, okay, Mom, does this make sense? And she said, oh, it makes total sense. So it's like, well, yeah, I know. It doesn't, when you draft, it doesn't have to be in sports. It can be in something else, right? It's just where my mind went.
Well, on the note of football, unfortunately, we're out of time. So please join me in thanking you, Dr.
Well, it's great to be back here, and thank y'all for coming out, because it's been raining a whole lot, but it's nice to see so many faces, and I hope that it was somewhat informative. I would say I hope you really enjoyed it, except that it's not an enjoyable topic, right? But I hope you actually found it interesting, so thank you.
Thank you.